This video is describing the systems design section of the example business case for ICT 355-555, Systems Analysis and Design. So systems design. So this section of the document is where you are transitioning from doing analysis on business needs to really documenting the business requirements. The requirements in this section is really documenting what the IT developer is going to need to know when they build the solution for the business. That's why this section is very important. This section includes documenting things such as the data mapping and the user profile requirements, the system level requirements, and then the user interface designs, which includes inputs, outputs, and functional requirements, as well as auditing requirements for the system. So this first section in the example business case, what this outlines is the relational database design mapping that the system will need to support based on the different data elements that are needed to support the business. The first thing that was identified was the data stores that are needed. So these are these boxes. We need one for marketing, initial order, customer, case, product, etc. This is important because it provides a mapping of all the different data elements that are needed or used for each piece of the business that is going to use the system. So utilizing the data models that you put together back in the systems analysis phase, this is where the data elements are pulled together into a data stores or each piece of data information that is needed. It outlines where there's overlapping information to help visualize the central aspects of the data that needs to be stored. It's really to prevent duplicate information within the system. An example of this is customer information. So this section right here. As you conducted your analysis, you may have identified several business units that needed to be able to create, update, or view customer information. By outlining the data mapping, as you see here, you can create one central data store that houses all customer information, and then show the mapping to each of the different data stores that will use that information. So marketing is going to use this, the case itself is going to use this, addresses will be tied to it, and also the initial order. This provides the layout for IT as they're developing the data elements in the system so they know how the mapping should look. Again, to make sure data is centralized and each area isn't storing their information separately. As you'll see, this section has a narrative included with it. This is best practice to go along with the image to prevent any assumptions from being made from anybody who's looking at this image. The next section of system design is user profile requirements. Within the system, there needs to be profiles set up in order to set the appropriate access to each of the records within the system. So using the user models you did in the systems analysis phase, you can start identifying the user roles and profiles that are needed within the system. You may have profiles needed for managers versus users in different areas that will have access, and then what access they should have for each of the records or objects you're creating, such as the contact record or the services record in the system. As you develop each sprint, you'll be defining these records. So an org record, contact record, whatever records that you define that you're going to build out in the system. In this user profile section, you will then add that record and define the level of access for each of your profiles you've defined using CRED. And CRED stands for Create, Read, Edit, Delete. So essentially, it's telling you for this contact record, the customer care manager profile, there may be several people that have this profile, can create, read, edit, and delete this contact record. But you'll see for the customer care analyst, which again, there may be several analysts underneath this profile, they can only create, read, and edit. This tells IT how to set up the profiles and then the security for each of the records or objects that are created within the system. This section should also be completed with narrative to go along with the image, again, to prevent assumptions, and it is best practice to have narratives with an image. And this section in particular will continue to be updated for each of your sprints as you define new profiles or as you define new records or objects within the system. The next section is for system requirements. These requirements are at the overall system level. These include things that the system itself needs to be able to do. Some examples of these are like system performance. How many users does it need to support simultaneously? What should the response time of the system be? System reliability or availability, such as how often does the system need to be available? Does it need to be available 24/7? Does it only need to be up and running Monday through Friday from 8 to 5? System maintainability, such as does the system need to be able to be enhanced or defects fixed? System scalability, such as will there be future growth in volume and transactions? And when you're developing the system, does the system need to be able to account for that future design? System controls is another example. such as the system must only be available to log in when users are connected to the network and only through single sign-on authentication. So system security or system controls. So this provides really the high-level requirements for what the system itself, not the functionality within the system, but the system itself needs to be able to handle. Typically, these are things that can be defined up front and may not change. However, as you learn more from the customer, you may have a few additional requirements that are added throughout the sprint developments within the system requirements section. The next sections are actually broken out by items that you define for your sprints. So in the example business case, you can see I have one for sprint 1 with a bunch of information underneath of it, and then a section for the items that we developed in sprint 2. Within the example business case, we decided to do the customer object and the organization object or record within the system. So within the requirements, for each one of these objects, we have a user interface wireframes prototype section and then the image that is really used for any inputs or outputs that the customer needs. And then it has the supporting data requirements that go with this image. It also has the supporting functional requirements, which tells the developer how that image should function. So all of the buttons, all of the fields, anything that a user will do, what it should do when they code it. And then supporting auditing requirements. So the user interface wireframe prototype is built with your customer with your design input. This really helps gather the information for the input or the output that you're designing with the user that needs to be developed within the system. So in this example, it shows the customer record, meaning this is the screen the business will use to create a customer in the system. It shows the layout of the screen and then the data elements on the screen. This is then used to identify the data requirements. The user interface provides the developer with how the screen should look. So in the data requirements, this outlines each of the data elements that was on that screen and specific information about those data elements, such as the type of field it is, like a text field, numerical field, pick list or drop down field, what length the field needs to be, what the list of values are for that pick list field, what the format of the field needs to look like. So in this instance for customer ID, this is the format it needed to look like. It also captures if the field is required or not required and when it becomes required. So in this sense, salutation is not required, but customer status is required. First name is required upon customer record create. So it outlines those rules for when the field is required or not required. It also provides specific auditing requirements at the data field level, as there may be a field like a unique identifier that is generated by the system and no one should be able to update it, such as this customer ID. It's going to be auto-generated, so nobody should be able to update that. The data requirements really provide the developer with the field requirements for the user interface wireframes. So the user interface wireframes gives them the layout and what should be on there, but then they need to know how to build these fields. What should these fields look like? Which is what the data requirements provide them. The next piece of this is functional requirements, which provides the developer with how the user interface should function. So looking at the user interface, what should happen if I click save? What should happen if I click cancel? What happens if I enter a wrong address? What happens if I enter an email address that already exists in the system? Are there error messages that need to pop up? Or should the form change dynamically if a user enters or selects a certain value in a field? Should other fields become available for them to enter? So that's why these functional requirements are important. These tell the developer what they need to know about how the user interface they are building should function. So you'll see in here I have what happens when I click the save, what happens when I click the cancel button. I have rules in here that a contact record must only be able to be associated to one organization record at a time. I have in here that the email address entered for a contact must be unique. If an email address is already being used, they would display a message with a link to the existing contact record already using that address. So it really tells the developer when a user does something on the screen, how should it function? This next section talks about the auditing requirements that relate specifically to this user interface record, such as does there need to be auditing on each of the fields or only certain fields that need to be tracked in the audit history? So if I create this contact record, should it be logging that I created that record? What happens if I update this record? If I come in and update the email address, should it be capturing what the original email address was and what it changed to in an audit history so that we have that record? And then is there any audit checks that need to happen that need to notify somebody of something? So this one in particular has a report being generated, being sent to customer care for all organization records that do not have at least one contact record. Because in the system, we're going to have an organization record, and we're going to have several contacts that can be tied to that organization record. But we want to be aware of any organizations that don't have any contacts out there to see if maybe we need to clean those up, or maybe we missed attaching a contact to that organization. So this is really about the auditing requirements. So all these requirements gathered, so the data requirements, the functional requirements, and auditing requirements all help support that user interface wireframe that you create within the requirements. So essentially, I could be able to hand this over to an IT developer and give them the user interface wireframe, the data requirements, the functional requirements, and the auditing requirements, and they should be able to go and develop this in the system. As you'll see in this example business case, there are multiple records or objects. So the next one I had was organization, and it follows the same format. I have my user interface wireframe or prototype, which is for the input or the output. I have the data requirements, I have the functional requirements, and I have the auditing requirements that support that. And as I mentioned, in this example business case, we split the objects out by sprint. So we have a section for sprint 1, and the objects that we created and the requirements that go along with it, and then a section for sprint 2, which is then going to be for product and service type, which again follows that same logic where you need the user interface prototype, the data requirements, the functional requirements, and the auditing requirements. All of these requirements gathered is what is reviewed with the business and developer, and then the developer uses these to develop the system. And this concludes the overview of the systems design section of the business case. See other videos created for the example business case for other sections of this document.